On March 16, 1984, at the Baton Rouge Airport in Louisiana, a young man had just disembarked from a plane and was being escorted in handcuffs by police. As they passed a public payphone, an unidentified man suddenly pulled the trigger, shooting the detainee in the head. The police shouted in shock as they tackled the shooter. "Why, Gary? Why did you do that?" The police seemed to know exactly who the man was. As they pinned him to the ground, the man, now in tears, said, "If someone did that to your child, you'd do the same." Who was that man, and what happened between them? The young man who was attacked and the man who suddenly appeared had a connection: coach and student's parent. This shocking incident stirred up public outrage, made the evening news, and was followed by millions of people. However, most of the public sided with the shooter. He was simply standing up for what's right. He's not guilty. Because there was a bitter truth behind this case. Gary Plauché, 39 years old, was an ordinary salesman with 4 children. In his younger years, he briefly served in the United States Air Force. After leaving the military, he worked as a cameraman for a local TV station, living a simple life. Gary spent most of his free time coaching the neighborhood kids' baseball team. He felt proud being called coach by the children. The child in the story was Gary's son, Jody. Just like his father, Jody was outgoing and loved sports. When Jody turned 10 and Gary saw that his son and his brothers were interested in a new sport, Korean-style karate, he enrolled them in a Hapkido training center. And this man was Jeffrey Doucette, 24 years old, the Hapkido instructor for the kids. Jody said that Jeffrey was like a powerful father figure, but also like a close friend. Outside of training sessions, Jeffrey would show the kids movies and take them ice skating. Jody told his family that Mr. Jeffrey's only source of income was teaching Hapkido. He was from another town, had no family or friends in the area, and lived right inside the dojo. Hearing that, Gary felt so sorry for Jeffrey that he was nearly brought to tears. So he told Jody to bring Mr. Jeffrey home so he could shower and get some clean clothes. Jeffrey was even invited to the family's regular Sunday dinners at Jody's grandfather's house. From then on, Jeffrey began spending more and more time with Jody and his family. But no one in the family could have foreseen that this trust and closeness would lead to danger. When trust turns into a nightmare. One day in March 1983, Jody had a strange experience. Coach Jeffrey told him that he needed to stretch his muscles, so he spread Jody's legs and began touching them. Suddenly, Jeffrey placed his hand on Jody's private area. When Jody looked surprised, Jeffrey quickly said, "It was an accident. We're just stretching." But this strange accident didn't end there. Jeffrey often drove Jody home after practice. He would place Jody on his lap, saying it was to teach him how to drive, then circle around the neighborhood. He handled the gear shift while guiding Jody's hands on the steering wheel. Suddenly, he placed his hand on Jody's knee. The boy seemed startled. Seeing this, Jeffrey quickly pulled his hand back and said, "Oh, that was an accident." Then he continued driving as if nothing had happened. Sometime later, Jody began to understand the true meaning behind those actions. Jeffrey said he was testing Jody's boundaries to help him recognize the typical behavior of child molesters. He pretended to make an observation, saying that Jody was sensitive to touch, then continued to ask how he felt when being touched. In this way, Jeffrey gradually and systematically touched Jody over the course of several months. Little by little, the level of physical contact increased. One day, he abruptly ended a training session and told all the kids to go to a nearby convenience store to buy snacks, except for Jody. While they were gone, he took Jody into a back room and gave him a massage. Jeffrey's increasingly bold actions reached their peak during a Hapkido camping trip in Texas late at night after all the kids had fallen asleep and an old movie was playing on the TV. Jeffrey turned it off and slipped into Jody's blanket. For an entire month, he continued performing inappropriate acts on Jody using his mouth. Innocently, Jody asked, "Why are you doing this to me?" Jeffrey replied, "I don't know why either." Jeffrey's vile actions didn't stop there. They happened almost every day, sometimes even twice a day, but Jody didn't dare to tell anyone about it. That summer, a national Hapkido tournament was held, and Jody took first place in his division. Jody's parents were overjoyed over the news and trusted Jeffrey even more. But there was one person who noticed that something about the relationship between the instructor and student didn't seem quite right. While Jody was at the Hapkido camp, his parents mentioned that they would be sending him to stay at his uncle's house for the weekend. Jeffrey immediately said he would take Jody there himself. Jody's uncle later recalled, "He didn't say a word for a while after Jody got out of the car, like he was upset that Jody was staying with me. And then he kissed Jody on the mouth to say goodbye." Jody's uncle found this behavior strange and brought it up with Gary. Gary responded, "Well, I'm his dad and I've never kissed him on the mouth." However, Gary simply assumed it was just a close teacher-student relationship. For the next 6 months, Jody endured horrific experiences almost daily, both at the Hapkido studio and at the hotel where he stayed. Later, when asked why he didn't tell anyone, Jody said, "I was only 11 years old at the time. I knew that what was happening to me would break my parents' hearts." Gary often said he wouldn't let anyone get away with hurting his kids. And Jody knew he wasn't joking. Sometime later, the boy began to feel afraid and wanted Jeffrey to stop. He thought about telling his parents but didn't know how to bring it up to escape the control and abuse of his filthy instructor. Jody started skipping class, hoping his parents would notice something was wrong. But Gary and Jan assumed it was just typical rebellious behavior of adolescence. Not to mention, Jeffrey would come to Jody's house every time and convince his mother Jan John trusted the instructor and sent Jody with Jeffrey, believing that he understood Jody better than anyone else. And at a certain point, Jeffrey wanted to completely possess Jody. At 9 a.m. on February 19th, 1984, Jeffrey picked Jody up as usual. Jody's mother handed the child over to Jeffrey without a hint of suspicion. But as hours passed and they didn't return, Jan gradually became terrified. The family eventually contacted the police to search for Jody. Jan went to a town, Jeffrey's hometown. There she heard from Jeffrey's brother that they had returned home, but by the time she arrived, they were already gone. That day, Jeffrey took Jody on a bus heading to the West Coast. Along the way, Jeffrey shaved his beard and dyed Jody's blonde hair black. He did this with the intention of making Jody look like his son and to evade the detectives who would soon be searching for them. He didn't even tell Jody where they were going. He simply said, "You are my son. I'll tell everyone, you're my son." That was the first time Jody saw the Hollywood sign, so he was very surprised and excited. He had no idea that he was being kidnapped by his evil coach. They took a bus to Anaheim and went to Disneyland the next day. Their final destination was California, 200 kilometers away. On February 28, 1984, 9 days after they had left, Jeffrey allowed Jody to call his mother. Meanwhile, the FBI was tracking them. Jeffrey made a collect call which allowed the FBI to trace their location to the Samoa Hotel in Anaheim. The FBI found them immediately. Through the phone receiver that was still on the line, Jan heard the sound of the FBI breaking down the hotel room door. Jeffrey surrendered without resistance and was arrested. Jody was taken straight to the hospital, where doctors examined him to determine if he had suffered any harm. The next day, Jody returned to Louisiana with his once light blonde hair, now a deep black. At the New Orleans airport, Jody's family was waiting for him. He denied any severe abuse to both his parents and the police. The family breathed a sigh of relief, seeing that the boy looked bright and healthy. However, 12 days later, Jody's rape kit came back positive. His parents were devastated. For any parent, the worst nightmare is having their child violated in such a sensitive way. What made it even more tragic was that the perpetrator was Mr. Jeffrey, the very man the family had once deeply trusted. Gary had endured both of those horrific things at once, and when the rage and torment reached their peak, he lost control and did something no one could have ever imagined. On March 16, 1984, 2 weeks had passed since Jody returned home. Jeffrey was scheduled to be extradited to Louisiana to stand trial. 2 police officers were assigned to accompany him. One of them was Bud Connor. He stated that on the plane, Jeffrey broke down in tears and confessed the story of how he had grown up and how he had been sexually abused as a child. He also handed them a 3-page written account detailing what he had done and what had happened to him. The other accompanying officer was Mike Barnett, a longtime friend of Gary's family. Mike said, "We didn't intend to question him, but it seemed like he wanted to get everything off his chest. He confessed to having touched so many children that he couldn't even remember them all. We were going to prosecute him and let him spend the rest of his life in prison." But Gary was consumed by unbearable guilt. He decided to eliminate Jeffrey with his own hands. Gary believed that if he didn't get rid of him, Jeffrey would continue to harm his son and other children. A few days later, he sat for hours in a local bar. Gary asked people when they thought the criminal would be brought back to Baton Rouge Airport for trial. A former co-worker of Gary's who happened to be out drinking and now worked at WBRT News told Gary that Jeffrey would be arriving at the airport at 9 p.m. A little after 9 p.m. on March 16, 1984, the plane carrying Jeffrey landed at Baton Rouge Airport. Gary was also at the airport sipping a cup of coffee in the restaurant before moving to the bar for a bottle of beer. He paced back and forth in the lobby, checking flight times from a public phone, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. Gary concealed a .38 caliber handgun in the right leg of his pants. While pretending to talk on the phone, he waited for the right moment. Gary informed his close friend about what he was about to do. That friend tried to talk him out of it and even alerted the police, but it was already too late. As Gary made the call, several reporters from WBRT News were already prepared with their cameras to capture the scene of the police convoy escorting Jeffrey off the plane. Jeffrey was seen stepping into the airport lobby when the cameras began flashing repeatedly. Suddenly, Gary lunged forward and fired at Jeffrey, causing him to collapse to the ground. Gary then slammed the phone receiver down. Mike, the officer who had accompanied Jeffrey, immediately disarmed Gary and shouted, "Why? Gary, why did you do that?" The entire incident was recorded and broadcast live, attracting millions of viewers. Public opinion overwhelmingly supported Gary's act of taking justice into his own hands. Linda Boy, a 25-year-old airport waitress, told a reporter, "Wayson Boss, about 2 weeks after the shooting, I would have shot him too if he had done those things to my sons." A captain who was present at the airport at the time commented on Gary, "He's not a murderer. He's a father who did it out of love for his son and out of pride." Television stations were flooded with calls offering financial support and other assistance for Gary. Jeffrey was critically injured, fell into a coma, and died the following day at a charity hospital in New Orleans. The morning after the incident at his grandparents' house, Jody heard his mother recount what had happened. He saw the scene for the first time on the 6 p.m. news. Jody said he saw very clearly the moment his father shot Jeffrey. He recorded the footage on tape and said, "Everyone told me not to watch it, but I rewound it and watched it over and over again. It didn't feel real." At first, Jody felt like his father had gone insane. He was angry about what his dad had done because Jody only wanted Jeffrey to stop, not to die. "I couldn't accept my father's actions. But in some way I understood," Jody said. In that kind of situation, parents, rather than seeking revenge and becoming criminals, should focus on being there, protecting and helping their child get through it. But he knew that no matter what had already happened, the trial was difficult. In court, Gary did not contest the charges brought by the prosecution. He said he had known the consequences of taking revenge and was ready to accept the verdict. The defense attorneys argued for leniency. They pointed out that Gary had suffered severe psychological trauma due to his son being abused, which led him to make a tragic mistake. The report on his mental state would have a significant impact on the sentencing. Gary's shooting sparked intense legal debate. Prosecutor Robert Hester stated, "Whether or not to charge Gary Plauché will be one of the grand jury's toughest decisions. The dilemma is this: if we say what he did wasn't wrong, are we opening the door for a rape victim's husband or the parents of an abused child to do the same thing Gary did? If the grand jury says what Gary did is forgivable, what do we do when the next victim seeks revenge? Where do we draw the line?" Accepting the psychologist's assessment, along with the details of the case and the overwhelming public support for Gary, the judge decided not to send him to prison. Specifically, the judge stated that doing so would be counterproductive and affirmed that Gary had no intention of harming anyone other than the now deceased Jeffrey. As part of a plea agreement, Gary was convicted of manslaughter and received a sentence of 7 years suspended, 5 years probation, and 300 hours of community service. Even so, Jeffrey's death caused a period of distance between father and son. Gary and Jan understood the reason and didn't pressure Jody to reconnect, instead waiting for him to heal at his own pace. Years later, Jody gradually overcame the psychological trauma from his childhood and was able to accept his father once again. This is an image of Jody and his father Gary appearing on a year-end program to share the story of Jody's abduction and Gary's act of revenge 35 years after the incident. Jody, now 47, wrote a book titled Why Gary? Why the very words shouted by Officer Mike at Gary when he pulled the trigger on Jeffrey, the abuser. The book recounts what happened to Jody and how he overcame the psychological trauma. In addition, Jody has been helping children in similar situations since his college years. He now works as an educator, supporting abused children and advocating for abuse prevention. The heartbreaking story of Gary's family truly resonates as a deep pain for every parent. No matter where in the world, children are the most precious treasure to their families. Sometimes even a small wound on a child's body can tear a parent apart, let alone when their child becomes the victim of a depraved child abuser. So perhaps they truly understood the pain and decisive action Gary took at that time. His resolve was evident even shortly before his death at the age of 67. From a stroke, when someone asked if he regretted what he had done, Gary once again firmly stated, "I have no regrets. Even if I had the chance to choose again, I would do the same thing." Do you think Gary was a good father delivering justice or a murderer who disregarded the legal system?